Welcome to the Redbeard Embodiment Podcast. I am your host, Alex Green, and I'm on a mission to bring the power of embodiment to people all around the world. In this podcast, we explore how embodiment practices, trauma healing, and knowledge about the human nervous system can help us find our ground, discover new sources of meaning, and create connection in an ever-changing world. The deepest change is embodied change.
All right. Well, Ellen, so good to sit down with you and have this chat. We think we have a lot to talk about. What do you think?
Just a little bit.
So just to set the scene a little bit. So, Ellen and I are together this weekend in Boulder, Colorado, and we are working on some Zen Integration Bodywork training, which we'll cover in today's podcast a little bit about. But what we thought would be fun is just to share about Ellen and I have had a sort of a weaving path where we've been colleagues and friends and collaborators in several domains. And so we thought it would be fun just to sit down and tell that story about the work that we do and how we're continuing to extend that. Yeah.
Cool.
Where should we begin? What do you think?
At the very beginning.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about when you and I first connected. So probably,
I was thinking about that today.
Yeah.
I think it was either 2012 or 2013.
Yeah.
And the way that I remember it is that in the same week, two different people were like, you got to go check out this body worker. And they gave me the name of your business. And I was like, oh, does he have a red beard?
Right. The question everybody asks.
The classic question, right? Yeah. They were like, no. He's a Zen dude. And they gave me a little bit about Bodhidharma. Anyways, so I decided to come get some body work, and the rest is history from there. But this work is how I met you, right? It started in on the 10 series, pretty much right out of the gate.
Yeah.
And that really just kind of opened all the doors to that.
Well, let's talk a little bit about your background. I mean, we'll get to sort of the present tense, but if we go back, sort of your roots in yoga and the streams. So when you and I met, I was doing body work. I'll talk about that. Yeah. But just sort of where were you in your professional journey at that time?
Yeah. So I was new to Madison. At that point, I was a yoga teacher, primarily teaching group classes, had some private clients that I was working with. But the majority of my kind of professional work was teaching group classes, which I had been doing already for a couple of years coming from Michigan. So it was kind of in the throes of that, but really knew at least at that point that I wanted to really dive into working therapeutically with people. So was actually getting ready to start my first therapy-based training. And that was what I was sort of swimming in is how is this going to look? Where's this going to go forward? I knew that I really felt called to work with people individually. And so just had a lot of curiosity, I think, and was out kind of dabbling as people do, what's this body work like? What's that thing like? Just to kind of keep working with my own body and my own nervous system. I had my own physical stuff going on. I was in my late 20s, I guess, at that point. And, it was about 10 years out from finishing my swimming career, and was actually still kind of negotiating with my nervous system around a little bit actually what we talked about today. What's it mean to move a body when you're not training to win a race?
5 hour swim practices a day. Like you were sharing.
I was training at a really elite level, really intense level, and then stopped. Yeah. What does it mean to be in a body? What does it mean to move a body? What's reasonable? What's normal? What feels right? And when I look back at that time, I was really renegotiating a lot of that. And I think having to do that really in-depth personal investigation was also part of what made me curious about working with individuals, because group classes were great, but I knew there was a lot of depth to plumb. And I think my work with you really was, I mean, if I'm being really honest, was the beginning of me really like plumbing some depths that I hadn't been able to do yet. And then the other thing that was part of that plumbing the depths was somatics. And really kind of, you know, my relationship to my body and movement had been so young, so intense. Go, push, drive, use your body, make your body do what you need it to do.
Sure.
And I like this being with
was a different
was
speed.
like completely different thing.
Well, so I have a question about that. So, you know, so your intense swimming career.
Yeah.
And then if I understand correctly, you know, your somewhat abrupt ending.
Yep.
You know, it was clear when you were done, you were done.
Yeah.
And then now you're in this phase of kind of what is it, being a body now? What was was it sort of an immediate pivot into yoga at that time? Was that a pretty, what was that like?
I was introduced to yoga as a teenager.
Okay.
My mom took me to my first class. It was an Anusara class, actually. And I took classes with that teacher for a little while and then kind of pivoted so yoga had been in and out of my life to some degrees, as it does with many college students. Like when I was home and like
Sure.
Mom took me to class, I would go. But you know, and then I had a VHS tape. I did at college a whole bunch. So that was always there, but it's like the way that I approached it was still with that kind of what I'm going to call my swimming mentality. Push, do, how bendy can you be? How aggressive can you go? And actually what happened was one of my first, like what I'll call my first like serious teacher, T.S. Little, he introduced me to somatics. And there's a theme that will come up in this conversation was I hated it. This is a thing for me.
Come up a few times.
I was like, I hate this. It makes me cry every time I do it. I don't understand it. We're not even moving. Like, this is stupid and I hate it.
Okay, so two things need a definition for our audience. So somatics, because we've got somatic experiencing, we're Redbeard somatic therapy. We use that somatic. So when you say somatics, you were starting to get into somatics. Just tell us what that is.
So when I say somatics, I'm talking about work that comes from Thomas Hanna. So Thomas Hanna was a senior student originally of Moshe Feldenkrais. So in a way, this is related to Feldenkrais work.
Sure.
But he kind of developed his own lineage of movement, and Tias was kind of riffing on Hanna's work. He introduced me to that, and then I continued to follow that pathway with my own therapy training. Yes, so when I say somatics, I mean Hanna's work. We should just say Hanna Somatics. Hanna Somatics, I should totally. Hanna Somatics. I will. That's a good idea. So Tias introduced me to Hanna Somatics,
right?
And it was you know, I'm grateful, like, if I'm going to give myself any props, is like, I had enough curiosity to know that like my resistance to that, there was information there.
Sure.
And so it led me to kind of continue to investigate that. And that's been a theme that's come up in a few different places. Like eventually it comes up with TRE and other things and meditation, all of which have now become huge parts of my own life.
So the rule of thumb for you is if you hate something, you have to look probably it's in a few years' time, it's gonna be something you're gonna be doing a deep dive in.
Correct.
That's what I'm
that is like still true.
The other thing that needs to find is, so that you said this around the time you and I met was just before you knew you wanted to do one-on-one work. You wanted to teach yoga classes that you've been doing for a while. You wanted to teach one-on-one work, and then you said you were just about to get into therapy. And I think you mean yoga therapy. So just tell. So that was kind of a next big phase of professional work for you. Can you just define that a little bit?
So I'm a yoga therapist, which means that I did the, you know, in the yoga world, there's a 200-hour training, and then you can go and get 300 more hours to be 500-hour. My 300-hour had a therapy focus. How do you work one-on-one with someone? Primarily focused on like physiological stuff. Okay, the people have a knee replacement, a meniscus tear, they have a herniated disc in their lumbar, more like focus on clinical applications of yoga asana. And we also used Hanna Somatics in that. And then I wanted to continue to go a little bit further with that. So then I went into a 2-year program with Yoga North that was an additional 1,000 hours. And the primary tool there was Hanna Somatics. We also used yoga asana, pranayama, which is breath work, and all of those tools. But with that, the application started to extend a little bit beyond just what's happening in your anatomy into psychosomatically and your psychology, and how is all of that in your body. And so that I really wanted to be able to pull that in as well. So
well, I want to tell one funny story. You tell this story sometimes, but I'll tell it today.
You tell.
From our early work, so great confidentiality in our sessions.
I know where you're going.
So I remember working with you, and I we did a 10 series and maybe some other work, and 10 series referring to structural integration, 10 series work, and something I came to really appreciate was sort of an anatomical specificity about what was happening in your bodies, almost like in a narration. So Ellen would be laying there, I'm doing my work, and she's like, oh, I feel my 1/6 of my anterior fiber of my levator scapula rotating slightly anterior medially. And I was like, wow, this is a high degree of proprioceptive, interoceptive specificity. So I kind of would like noodle on that for a while. I was like, never seen somebody have this sort of know what every single muscle fiber is doing.
Right.
But then at a certain point, I made a comment, it sort of dawned on me. I was like, I sort of feel like it's like a little bit like you're on like a Google Maps view of observing your body while this is happening. And that's probably really useful, but like, are you sometimes inside of your body? Are you sometimes just feeling what's going on? And so, we kind of had a conversation about that.
Totally. But that comment, I referenced that comment, like it comes up for me periodically. It's sort of like, there's, I think, I'll make a general statement. Like, I think for lots of people, these like moments where it's like, oh, something lands in a particular way. And then that like continues to come back up. And it's like, oh yeah, there's that thing again. Oh yeah, there's that thing again. And that was one of those moments for me where that landed and helped kind of shift that from like using my body to being in my body to feeling my body. And like really more, to use the word again, somatic, but it not meaning in Hanna Somatics way, but in a somatic
well, I was
way.
Just going to say the same thing. So like one classical definition of the word somatic is somatic refers to soma or the body, but the body we live in. It's sort of the felt, not body as an object, but body as a subject. So
exactly.
Speaking to that.
Yeah.
Super cool.
Yeah.
Well, why don't I share a little bit about kind of where I've been leading up to that?
Totally.
Okay, so what did we say, 2013-ish?
12, 13, something like that.
13, 14. So for me, my journey into structural integration body work, I have to trace my own history back to my Zen training first. So for me, out of college, with my was a different time is to help to tell the story of being pulled into Zen training, but that was sort of a big focus for my early 20s, mid-20s, still now, but it was kind of all I did for a period as a monk in residence for several years. And I had a really pivotal experience with one of the founders of Chosei, the Zen temple in Hawaii that I did my training at, where in a conversation he was, and I had been studying philosophy and physics, and he kind of would tease me about my sort of intellectual self. But at one time he got serious and he said, what is it that you're really like trying to understand? What are you really going for? Like, what are you really wanting to know? And I said, and I didn't have an answer. So he kind of answered for me. He said, you're looking for the meaning of life, aren't you? In a really serious way. And I said, yes. And he said, well, I'll give you a hint. You're not going to find it in physics and philosophy. From my point of view, this is him speaking, my point of view, the meaning of life can be discovered within the refinement of breath and posture. And at that time, sort of an intellectual, and I'd started my meditation training, but that felt like the most radical idea to me. Like, really? Like somehow attending to my body, attending to my breath, somehow this is gonna, bring me deep philosophical realizations. It didn't track for me at that time. So that was, in Zen, we use the word koan. And so that was my koan for a long time. I feel like I finally have answered it, by the way. But anyway, so for me, that was kind of a guiding star, is that I really want to understand, okay, well, how do I understand? How do I find meaning? How do I find depth? Not at the intellectual level. And he gave me this clue to look in my body. And so in my meditation sitting and my martial arts practice, that was sort of my question. How does studying here add up to something that's bigger, broader, deeper? At some point I got exposed to body work. There's the body work that I studied kind of came out of the lineage at the dojo. It's sort of an interesting history of West meets East, because there was a Dub Lee was a sort of a pioneering Western body work person in the, I don't know, 60s, 70s, 80s. I met him just before he died. He trained under Ida Rolf. He trained directly with Moshe Feldenkrais and a number of other people. And then in his retirement years, he went to Hawaii, and somebody brought him to the dojo, Chozenji, the same temple I referred to. And he got to know that the same person who had just, Tano Hiroshi, the person who had told me about, the clue to look for the meaning of life was in my body. He spent a lot of time working with Dub. And what Tano Hiroshi was incredibly gifted at, in addition to his Zen and martial arts training, of which he was, a real stellar example, say the least, was he was very gifted at from an Eastern perspective of what we call sort of energetics. So he could both hands-on and hands-off. He just was sort of a master of sensing and manipulating chi, or ki in the Japanese tradition. So a lot of that got transferred into Dub, who had had this Western training with Feldenkrais, with Rolfing, and then so he formed a body of work called Zen Body Therapy. I didn't study directly from him because he was quite old. He was in his 90s by the time I was around. Right. But his longtime partner, Audrey, continued to teach under the Zen Body Therapy banner. And then another core student of his, Everett Ogawa, ultimately developed his own work called Integral Bodywork. And that was, between the two of them, that was my sort of foundational training. And that was around late, like 2009, 2010 was when, and for me, it was okay, I've invested a lot in meditation. I've invested a lot of time in martial arts, but I'm wanting to kind of go out into be of service in the world. And so having this body work became just this very interesting way for me of taking the principles of breath and posture and that we do in Zen training, and you know so well now, and bringing that into a practice that can benefit another person. So through body work. So when you and I connected, I was probably 3 years into my private practice. That was, I would call that maybe my I'd call it my Shugyo phase of bodywork training, because Shugyo is a Japanese word referring to just intensive practice. Because at that time, I felt like I was just living, eating, breathing bodywork. It's sort of like I didn't care how much somebody paid me. If I could get them on my table, I was just trying to work as many people as I could, because for me, that's what I needed to just really find out what it was all about. Yeah. So that was kind of, so that was where we intersected. Yeah. So what came next? I mean, we were just sort of clients and friends for a while, but then what was the next chapter?
Yeah. So at that point, I had another friend who was also a Zen priest. So I was kind of starting to dabble a little bit with meditation in a different Zen lineage. Right. You had your Zen training. Right. You were introduced to TRE. Right. Right. Yep. And then you introduced me to TRE, which once again was meh. Initially, but then followed that
trainer,
TRE trainer together with you. Yeah. but then I think from there, what was interesting is we went through a phase where the way that I talk about it sometimes is that from my perspective is like we were each other's guinea pigs. Oh, I'm learning this new thing.
Definitely.
Like, can you like come over and we can like do some of this?
Yeah.
And so there was this kind of collaborative, almost in a way training together, but not officially doing any training together. It wasn't
but it
Zen
was definitely
training.
bodywork training.
Yeah, in exchange.
Yeah.
I have lots of fun memories of bending you over a yoga chair.
Yeah. No, I'm not sure I call those fun memories in my own memory, but yeah, I do have those memories. Yeah.
And then I think those collaborations, the next step from there was Somatic
Somatic
Zen.
Zen.
Yeah, which was just like a total delight.
Yeah.
And I remember you proposing it to me.
Yeah.
And actually feeling a little bit intimidated because the first time that we were running it, I knew how important your Zen training was to you. And I felt like a little bit of like a newbie who was like trying to see how I felt about Zen and in a different lineage.
Right.
And I also knew that this first sort of like beta that we were going to run, there were going to be some pretty senior students there. And so I was like, ooh, can I like hold my own with these folks? Right.
Okay.
But so for me, there's a couple things that were interesting about that first Somatic Zen that we ran. Let's
tell it what it
define
was.
it.
Yeah. Well, what was that? So it was trees.
So, yeah, it was a retreat, but more, I think it was taking a model of intensive Zen training and expanding that and bringing in other tools to see how that can support Zen training. So rather than using martial arts and manual labor,
right, the traditional
the more traditional forms, we sort of broke that open and used somatics, TRE, yoga, sound was a huge emphasis, resonance. So it was very experimental. And well, one, it was just so freeing to be in that experimentation. But
and let me jump in. And then that first training, we borrowed somebody's farm in what sort of Aspen Green, not quite to Viroqua, the Driftless region of Southwest Wisconsin.
The middle of nowhere.
And our training, our Zendo, if we call it that, was awesome, by the way, but it was kind of an old barn. And it was filthy dirty. But we spent about 6 hours cleaning.
I've never cleaned so hard or fast
in our life. But then we had this magnificent, it was sort of it was kind of like a dome, not a dome, like a.
Yeah, it was just like
kind of a rounded barn, open to the outside. And remember how we got anyway. So we just had this very rustic space, but we laid out yoga mats. Ellen led Hanna Somatics work. But it was really a layering of the Western things we were exploring, some Hanna Somatics. We didn't do bodywork that time.
No, we didn't.
But we brought, but a backbone of meditation. I think we did Tai Chi. So we brought in some of the,
that's
traditional forms, some of the, and we ran that program several times per year over until COVID.
The pandemic. Some years 4 times. Right. So it was a huge part. And for me, those Somatic Zens, the way I explained it to my Zen teacher, Ken Krishna Roshi, was that sitting in that first Somatic Zen, I was like, this is home. This is the community that I want to sit in. It was just like so clear.
Your people.
Those are my people. But even more than that. Well, that was a huge part of it. I don't want to undersell that.
No, it doesn't have to be people.
It wasn't people. But it was also this, like, to speak to what Tonoi Roshi said, like, it was breath and posture. It was how we were in our bodies.
Right.
That changed everything. And that really could be not just this thing you do on the side, but that is the training too. There's no difference. That was like completely life-changing for me and really a real pivot for me. And so then that feels like the beginnings of what I would call my Chosei Zen training, were those years of Somatic Zen with you.
Well, so then let's use the pandemic as a catalyst, because to me, sort of two things happened. I think you began your formal Zen training, which led into the priest training that you're doing now. I want you to talk about that in a second.
Yeah.
So that kind of led you deeper towards formal Zen training.
Yeah.
Not that you weren't training seriously before,
Yeah.
but it sort of intensified that.
Yep.
For me, made it clear that this was the time to take that something I've been leading up to, I feel like, but to take from the my roots in body work, my roots in Zen, but then some of the nervous system work,
Right.
like TRE, somatic experiencing, and because I knew there was a synthesis of those things that kind of I wanted to birth, so to
Yeah.
speak. So for me, kind of the pandemic became the catalyst for, okay, how am I going to train body work and Zen training, again, like you said before, not as sort of side by side, but that the body work is the Zen training. So
Yep.
I think let's talk about those two things.
Totally.
Yeah.
Should I start maybe with
Sure.
like kind of priest training sort of thing, or
Yeah.
where? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So, well, yeah. So when the pandemic hit for me, we were still doing some trainings together. We were meeting weekly, doing Tai Chi.
Well, we were already working together in Redbeard by
Oh,
that.
that's right. Yeah. So we were at Redbeard by then.
2019, right?
Yeah. And we had also taken some of our training. We were meeting every Thursday at the dojo.
Yeah.
We could talk about what dojo means in a second.
Yeah.
And so we were still doing the thing, and then we were trying to just carry that through. And for me and my own body and nervous system, it felt really clear, like it was the intensity of the pandemic. It was like, it's time to go deeper. Like it's time, like kind of a shit or get off the pot moment, like go. And so, yeah, exactly. That's when I became more my training took on a formal relationship with a Zen teacher.
Yeah.
And then also that timing aligned where we moved our offices,
Oh yeah.
our Madison offices into the dojo. So now I both work and train.
Yeah. One-stop shopping.
One-stop shopping for me.
Yeah.
It is like literally my whole
Well,
life.
yeah, let me describe a little bit, then I'll give it back to you.
Okay.
So Chosei Zen, which
Yeah.
Ellen referred to as her home dojo, and has several, dojos actually worldwide, but 2 in Wisconsin. There's a rural temple at my dad and stepmom's place in Spring Green,
Yep.
and then more recently, the Daiko Zenji the urban temple. And so they bought that building. It was an old church, and then the slow process of rehabbing it into a Zendo, and also where ultimately we moved our Madison Redbeard offices.
Yeah.
So, yeah, let's talk a little bit about temple and dojo.
Yeah.
I'll give it to you. Yeah.
So, I mean, well, we talk, it's interesting. We just had a conversation the other day in some priest training where your dad asked the question, why don't we say we're a temple? Why do we say we're a dojo? We don't really use the word temple very often, right? It tends to have a very like religious kind of connotation or feel to it.
Yeah.
Because we're not so concerned about that part of it.
Mm-hmm.
Sure, there can be ways that comes through, but really we are a dojo. We are a place of the ways. We're the place where people are working with duality and breaking through that. And and so when we're talking about Zen integration,
right.
This grand experiment of how do we make this a do? How do we make this a way? Right. So do you want to talk a little bit about what it means to be a do?
Yeah, well, just to sort of, come back to dojo. You just defined it nicely. Do as way, jo, place. So dojo is a place of the way, but the word way is in its, comes back to Taoism. It's the same Tao as in Taoism. And it's, but do is the Japanese translation. And, and we hear it in lots of things. So judo, karate do would be its form. So karate do. Kyudo, way of the bow. Those are martial arts. Kendo, way of the sword. But then there's fine arts. Shodo, way of the brush. Kado, way of the flower. Chado, way of tea. Right. So in the Japanese cultural context, one of the gifts of Japanese culture that the West can learn a lot from is part of what I talk about with Stephen Sensei in our next podcast is this concept of do, which is probably, a little bit not such a Western concept. Yeah. But it's the idea that almost anything can be studied not as an end to itself, but that, first there's a mastery of technique, but that's by no means the goal. The goal is some sort of higher realization of what it means to be a human. Now that's hard to define. I don't think we're going to try to define it right here, but it's this aspirational thing that many things can be practiced as a way of deep human development. You could even say spiritual development, but we could also just say human development. And so that idea, that concept of, whether it's tea ceremony, whether it's brushing calligraphy, whether it's chanting, whether it's a martial do, these forms look very different, but something ties them together, which is that they are seeking the same sort of attainment of the way. And so, that's really what the vision for Zen integration body work, what you and I are, working on right now, is again, how can body work rise to the level of a do?
Yeah.
I believe it can. I believe it does. I believe it will more as we go on with it. For me, just speaking briefly about what we're calling Zen integration bodywork, again, it's the bones of it, that the technique side of it is coming largely from the structural integration or wealthing tradition via those people that I referenced earlier. But the spirit of it is what are we conveying through that? Of course, we're releasing fascia, we're improving alignment. Those are a piece of it, but there's a larger intention, which is, how do we uncover the true human body or the true human form through that work? And in my view is that, and I think you view it the same way, but to me, when I'm at the table and I'm working on a neck, or I'm working on a psoas, or I'm manipulating a bone, for me, it's how do I take my Zazen meditation? How do I take my breath and posture? How do I take a sort of a centered quality? How do I bring that into movement, manipulation, become one with that other person to somehow create, to bring out more of who they are?
Yep.
Maybe that's one way to put it.
Yep.
I have to be pretty rooted in myself in order to be a facilitator for that kind of a process. And so, you and I, we always talk about in terms of experiments, because we've done so many experiments over the years. I mean, holy Toledo. So,
right.
Wow. But to me, the experiment we're doing now is that you wanted to learn. You've received so much body work, and you thought an extension of your training could also be studying body work. So we're more than a year now into a pretty deep dive into, and so Ellen, luckily I've got my first student of Zen integration bodywork. She's an A+. She gets a gold star for her sincerity towards it. But the reason I think of it as an experiment is because you are immersed in your own pretty deep dive in Zen training right now. You're in a 3-year committed thing towards priest training. You're very regularly practicing. So the experiment for me is, I got to teach the techniques. You got to focus on your Zen training. And can we, working together, can we bring that through into the work that we're doing?
Right.
So that's kind of where that's why it's alive for me. We'll speak to it from your view.
I think that's very true. And it's, I remember, it's just kind of a conversation with my Zen teacher coming to memory, where we had breakfast one morning. This was right when I had kind of asked him to be my teacher. So we're just beginning this more formal teacher-student relationship. And he's a Kyudo master. And we're having breakfast, and I said, just so you know, I'm not doing martial arts. I've done.
Oh, is this one of these things that you hated initially?
Didn't even try it. Just was like, not gonna do it. But same vein. We're swimming in the same pond there. But I was like, just so you know, I'm not gonna do martial arts. I've done tons of body training. Like I have a movement practice. There's only so many hours in the day. No, thank you. Just so you know. So of course, a year later, he's like, I think it's time to start a martial art. So I'm training in Hojo, which is a sword form.
Definition.
Which is a sword form. It's I guess it has I guess it's choreographed would be a simple way to say that. It's a choreographed sword push. So you're not,
Yeah.
but you're not sparring.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
It's a
So
kata.
It's a kata. Yeah.
Heavy wooden swords.
Yes. Heavy wooden swords.
When you said choreographed, it makes it sound a little wimpy. But I want to convey that this is not a wimpy sword form.
No, it's not a
like
wimpy sword
heavy
form.
wooden swords. There's a
Correct.
lot of yelling.
But there's a form. There's a
Yeah.
lot of yelling. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's been very interesting to actually dive into that, and for me, how it informs the body work.
Yeah.
In a way, because even though there's a form to Hojo, you also have to like drop all your inhibitions. You have to, and as a person living in a cisgendered female body,
Sure.
yell.
Yep.
And like go for it. And
Yeah.
that's been a very interesting thing for me to navigate in my body. And when I'm working on someone on the table, I also have to just drop everything. And so it's been really great training for just like, how do I just show up right here with this body and what it needs right now in this moment, and just like feel that.
Yeah.
And kind of cut through everything else.
Yeah.
And that, so there's just like this conversation body to body, and how do we meet that, and how do I, like with a sword, help them cut through whatever they need to cut through as
Sure.
well, and like show up to be part of that process for them.
Yeah.
So like these days, that's really in part how I feel it. But the other thing that's really interesting for me, and to get more specific, to continue on this more specific relationship to my Zen training, is I'm also training in Kado, which is the way of the flower. If you pick up a flower and look at it, it's just like looking at a body. It has a front, it has a back, it has an up, it has a down, and some of them bend sideways, right? Some of them. And, you have to really feel that flower, and like, how does it want to be placed?
Yeah.
And how can I present it in its best way so that its truest essence is coming through?
Right. And bring it to life.
Yeah. And it was exactly
Yeah.
what we're doing on the table.
Yeah, no, how fortuitous. I hadn't thought of it that way, that you had started sword training and also Kado, but flower. But it's so perfect, because what I was going to say is that I'm really, this wasn't coordinated, but it's really fortuitous. I'm really glad that Kushner Roshi, sort of pushed you to do Hojo, because my feeling was, I'm not sure I'd be able to teach the body work we're doing if you didn't have that. Because Budo training and later physical work, like, my earlier work moving logs and stuff like that, right? I had my woodworking time and cutting down trees. That there's a certain so our style of Zen Integration Bodywork, it's very physical.
Yeah.
There's a lot of amazing body work in the world. This particular style, it's deep, which doesn't mean brutal, but it's deep, and it requires a body that can deliver that.
Yep.
And in my view, sword training gives almost all, maybe plus flower, gives sort of all the needed analogies for, how do you move from here? How do you move from the hara? Yeah, how do you cut when how do you be clean with the delivery of a technique? How do you, just as you said, come into the work with, no inhibitions, bringing all of you to it. So I think that sword training really excels for that. So I think, but no, the delicacy of flower.
Oh, yeah.
And to me, of course, there's an up, down, there's a front, back. That's the least of it.
Oh, yeah, totally.
So there's also, there's talk about, ma'ai, like, the slightest, the one thing that I think Kado trains so well is a visual sense, but not from not in an analytical perspective, like this flower needs to be 1/3 or this or that, but there's a sense of composition that is unique to the actual flowers there in question, is unique to that day, right? The arrangement that comes to life has to be birthed out of that day, and that is really what I see. A good bodywork session as well. It's not formulaic,
right?
It's to the person. We can only sort of help bring forward what we can actually sense and see and cultivate in that co-collaboration. So the parallel. So later, someday, you and I, we're going to do some writing on bodywork, Kado,
love it,
and sword, because it's clear how they inform each other.
They really do. Yeah.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Redbeard Embodiment Podcast. To learn more, visit us at redbeardsomatictherapy.com. or send me an email at alex@redbeardsomatictherapy.com. If today's conversation resonated with you, help spread the word by subscribing and sharing with others. Hope to see you next time.